John said someone was coming who would baptize with fire. A later writer admits the fire appeared on the water during immersion. And one figure was attacked more than anyone else for claiming divine authority. Those three things are connected. Tonight, we're going to walk through why. Most people today think baptism is just a church ritual. You stand in a building, someone says some words, you get wet, and that means you belong. But that's how it's treated now. But if you go back to the first century, baptism was not a church membership ceremony. It was initiation. It marked a break from the old life. It marked entry into a movement. It usually happened in open waters, rivers, streams, and moving water. It was public. It was serious. It meant something. The word baptize comes from the Greek word baptizo, B-A-P-T-I-Z-O. That word means to immerse. It means to put something fully into something else. If you dip cloth into dye and it soaks all the way through, that's baptizo. If you push something underwater until it disappears, that's baptizo. It does not mean sprinkle. It does not mean lightly touch with water. It means full immersion. That happens and that matters when John the Baptist shows up in the Jordan River. He is immersing people. He is putting them fully underwater. And then he says something that people repeat all the time, but don't slow down to think about it. He says the one coming after him will baptize with the Holy Spirit and fire. If baptism means immersion, then when he says immersion in fire, he's not talking about something small. He's talking about total exposure, total participation, immersion in spirit, immersion in fire. Now, some people try to soften that. They say fire just means passion, or fire just means judgment, or fire just means spiritual energy. But if you move forward into the book of Acts, fire shows up as something visible. It says something like tongues that look like fire appeared and rested on those people. That's not private emotion language. That is description of something seen. So now we have something solid. Baptism means immersion. John promises immersion in spirit and fire. Acts connects fire with visible sign and spirit presence. Now fast forward about 200 years. Christianity has grown. It has spread across the Roman world. It is not unified. It is not organized the way people imagine. Different leaders disagree with each other openly. One of the biggest fights in the 3rd century is over rebaptism. That just means repeated baptism. Here's the issue. If someone was baptized by a group that later got labeled heretical, does that baptism count? Some leaders say no. They said if the person who immersed you was outside the true line of authority, your baptism is invalid. You need to be immersed again. Other leaders said no. If you're immersed in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, it counts. Even if the minister was outside that circle or their circle. That fight produces a short Latin word called De Rebaptismate. That just means on rebaptism. It is a text arguing that you should not repeat baptism if someone has already been immersed. But inside that text, there is a line that matters. The writer says that some people claim that when they went down to the water, fire appeared upon the water. He rejected this claim. He says it doesn't prove what they think it proves, but he admits that they were saying it. Think about that very slowly now. There were people in the 3rd century claiming that when they immersed someone in water, fire appeared upon the water. The writer argues against them. He tries to dismiss it, but he actually records it. Now connect that to John's statement, immersion in fire. Connect that to Acts, fire appearing as a sign. Connect that to this 3rd century report, fire appearing during immersion. That is not random language repeating itself by accident. Now bring Simon into the picture. Simon of Samaria appears in early Christian writing as a rival authority figure. He is connected to baptism. He is connected to claims of power. He is portrayed as someone who competed with the apostles. Later writers attack him heavily. They call him false. They call him a magician, but they cannot erase the fact that he had influence and followers. Some early sources say his teaching centered on fire as a first principle, meaning fire as the original power behind everything. That means fire was not decorative in his system. It was basic. It was foundational. I'll put the pieces side by side. John speaks of immersion in fire. Acts describes fire as visible sign of spirit. A 3rd century text reports that some group claimed fire appeared on the water during immersion. Simon is tied to baptismal rivalry and fire language. So what's at stake? Authority. If fire appears when someone is immersed, then that immersion carries its own validation. It does not need approval from a bishop. It does not need institutional endorsement. The fire is the sign, and that is exactly what would threaten an emerging structure trying to define who has the right to administer baptism and who does not. If legitimacy comes from visible fire presence, then hierarchy loses control. Now step back and think about what happens historically. As Christianity becomes more organized, authority becomes centralized. Bishops define validity. Councils define doctrine. Lines of succession are emphasized. That the more structured the system becomes, the less room there is for rival streams, claiming their own manifestation as proof. So when a 3rd century writer reports that some people said fire appeared on the water and then rejects that claim, he is not just arguing theology. He is defending his control, or their control. Now return to immersion itself. If baptizo means immerse, and if fire is paired with immersion, then baptism in fire means immersion in fire presence. It does not require reducing fire to a metaphor. It does not require turning it into emotional language. It simply follows the logic of the word. When John says immersion in fire, that is total language. When Acts describes fire appearing, that is visible sign language. When De Rebaptismate, now step back and think about what happens historically as Christianity becomes more organized, authority becomes centralized. Bishops define validity, councils define doctrine, lines of succession are emphasized. The more structured the system becomes, the less room there is for rival streams, claiming their own manifestations as proof. So when a 3rd century writer reports that some people said fire appeared on the water and rejects that claim, he's not arguing theology, he's defending control, a system. Now return to immersion itself. If baptizo means immerse, and if fire is paired with immersion, then baptism in fire means immersion in fire presence. It does not require reducing fire to a metaphor. It does not require turning it into emotional language. It simply follows the logic of the word. When John says immersion in fire, that is total language. When Acts describes fire appearing, that is visible sign language. When De Rebaptismate records a claim of fire appearing during immersion, that is rival legitimacy language. And when Simon is tied to baptismal rivalry and fire-centered teaching, the alignment becomes clear. This does not mean every detail is spelled out neatly in one place. History rarely works that way. What you have instead are pieces preserved in different texts. When those pieces line up in a consistent direction, you do pay attention. The rebaptism controversy shows that sacramental authority was still unsettled in the 3rd century. De Rebaptismate shows that some people claimed fire presence during immersion. John shows that immersion in fire was part of the original proclamation. Acts shows fire as a sign of spirit. If a river-based initiation movement claimed real fire presence as a part of the immersion practice, that would fit the pattern. If the movement was later absorbed, reframed, or attacked by institutional writers, that would also fit the pattern. The key is not hype. The key is consistency. Immersion means immersion. Fire means fire. Legitimacy in the early Christian language is often tied to manifestation. If manifestation occurs at immersion, that immersion carries weight. That is why that single line in De Rebaptismate matters. It preserves a memory. It shows that someone was claiming something dramatic at the water's edge. It shows that the fight was not just over repeating a ritual, it was over possessing who possessed authentic initiation power. Once you see that, the rebaptism controversy is no longer a minor church argument. It becomes a window into a deeper struggle over the source of authority in the early movement. Now we need to talk about Simon, because if you stop at baptism and never address him, the argument never tightens. Simon of Samaria is not a footnote in early Christian writing. He is one of the most attacked figures in the 2nd century and 3rd century. Writers like Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, Hippolytus, and others spend real time going after him. That alone tells you something. Ancient writers do not waste ink attacking someone who had no influence. If they keep bringing him up, it means his name still carried weight. According to those writers, Simon claimed divine authority. They say he called himself the Great Power. They say he represented himself in a threefold way. In one region, he appeared as the Father. In Judea, he appeared as the Son who suffered. Among the nations, he appears as the Holy Spirit. That language is preserved by his enemies. They are not trying to help him. They are trying to destroy his reputation. But in trying to destroy him, they preserve the shape of his claim. Now pause and think about that claim. Father in one place, Son who suffered in Judea, Spirit to the rest of the world. That's not small language. That is not the language of a village magician. That is the language of someone claiming to embody the full divine reality across regions. Now step back and compare the structure of that claim to what later becomes mainstream teaching about Jesus, Father, Son, Spirit, suffering in Judea, universal mission beyond one ethnic boundary. The overlap is obvious. You do not need complicated vocabulary to see it. The pattern lines up. Now let's connect back to baptism. John the Baptist stands in the river, immersing people. He is not in a temple. He is not in a priestly building. He is outside in open water. He announces that someone is coming who will immerse people in spirit and fire. That is river language. That is initiation language. It is anti-temple by nature because it bypasses the system of sacrifice and priesthood. It is direct. Simon, according to hostile sources, stands outside institutional control. He is portrayed as opposing established authority. He is not tied to temple power. He is not tied to priestly hierarchy. He is tied to rival initiation. He is tied to a movement that had continuity because after him, the sources say Menander took over leadership. That means Simon was not a one-day phenomenon. There was structure. There was succession. Now look again at the fire connection. Earlier, we saw that a 3rd century writer admits that some group claimed that when they immersed people in water, fire appeared on the surface. That writer rejected it. What he admits it was being claimed. Fire appearing during immersion or baptism is not a small detail. In a world where John promised immersion in fire, and Acts describes fire as a visible sign of the Spirit, fire during immersion functions as proof. It functions as what? Validation. If Simon is tied to fire-centered teaching, and if his movement is tied to baptismal rivalry, and if hostile writers preserved that he made sweeping divine claims, then the picture sharpens. You are not dealing with random myth. You are looking at a struggle over who represented the true continuation of the river movement that began with John. Now consider how the polemics work. When later writers talk about Simon, they frame him as false. They say he tried to buy spiritual power. They say he was rebuked. They say he failed. But at the same time, they preserve that he had followers, that his movement continued after him. They preserve that he made high claims about his identity. They preserve that he was active in the same regions at the same time where the Jesus story unfolds. If two figures are described as operating in overlapping space and time, making overlapping claims connected to overlapping authority, language, and one is later elevated while the other is attacked, you at least have to ask why the polemic is so intense. The intensity suggests proximity. It suggests rivalry, not distance. Now bring it back to immersion. If baptism means full immersion, and if John promises immersion in fire, then anyone who stands in the river and claims to immerse people with fire is directly stepping into that promise. If that person also claims divine identity in Father, Son, and Spirit language, and if he is attacked by later institutional writers, then the conflict is not minor, it is foundational. Menander taking over after Simon matters because it shows continuity. Movements do not continue if they have no core message. There was something strong enough in Simon's teaching to sustain leadership beyond him. That means the fight was not about one centric individual. It was about a stream of authority. And now step back to the broader pattern. Early on, authority is fluid. River initiation, open water, direct immersion, fire language. Over time, authorities become structured. Bishops define legitimacy. Councils define doctrine. Lines of succession are emphasized. Rival streams are labeled heretical. That is a shift from open manifestation to regulated control. So when you put it all together in plain terms, the pattern looks like this. John stands in a river and promises immersion in fire. A figure emerges who is tied to fire language, divine identity claims, and baptismal rivalry. That figure is attacked heavily by later writers who are building institutional authority. A 3rd century text admits that some group claimed fire appeared on the water during immersion. Authority becomes centralized and rival streams, well, they are suppressed. You are not forcing the pieces. You are placing them side by side and asking what they suggest. If immersion in fire is real, and if fire is a sign of legitimacy, and if a river-based movement claimed that sign, then whoever stood in that river claiming fire immersion would be presenting himself as the fulfillment of John's promise. That is where Simon enters the center of the conversation, not in the margins, as they put him. From there, you can circle back and say this clearly in simple words. If baptism means immersion, and if John promised immersion in fire, and if someone stood in the river claiming fire presence during immersion, then the claim is not symbolic. It is a direct claim to legitimacy. And if any later writers tried to separate that figure from the story, that became dominant. The polemic itself becomes part of the evidence that there was something powerful there in the beginning. Now the next step is to look at the gospel story itself and slow it down. Not the way people preach it, just read it plainly. Jesus appears in the same world John is already operating in. Same river movement, same immersion setting. He comes to John to be baptized. That means he enters the river movement first. He is not above it at the moment. He steps into it. He goes underwater, just like everyone else. After that immersion, the story says something happens. The Spirit descends. A voice speaks. It is framed as divine approval. In other words, immersion is followed by authentication. That pattern matches what we already saw. Immersion, then visible or audible, what? Confirmation. The structure is the same. Now look at what Jesus does after that. He moves outside the temple system. He teaches outside priestly control. He challenges established authority. He does not set up a new temple. He does not restore priestly hierarchy. He operates independently. That matches the river model more than the temple model, I would say. Now place that text to what hostile sources say about Simon. They say he claimed divine authority. They say he moved across regions. They say he identified himself in Father, Son, and Spirit language. They say he suffered in Judea. They say he had followers who continued after him, and they attack him as a rival to the apostolic leadership. So now you have two streams of narrative. In one stream, Jesus is baptized in the river. receives authentication, moves outside temple control, and speaks with universal authority. In another stream, Simon is described as a rival figure, claiming divine authority, connected to fire language, opposed by institutional leaders, and active in overlapping geography. At the same time, imagine that. The question is not whether later church writers wanted these two figures separated. Of course they did. The question is whether the separation reflects original history or later editorial control. John says immersion in fire is coming. The gospel narrative places Jesus in that river movement. Acts places fire at visible confirmation of spirit authority. A 3rd century text preserves a claim that fire appeared on the water during immersion. Simon is tied to fire-centered teaching and rival baptismal authority. If you strip away later layers and just look at the structure, you have a river initiation movement centered on immersion, spirit, and fire. You have a figure tied to that movement who is later elevated in one tradition and demonized in another. You have intense polemic against that rival. You have succession through Menander, showing continuity. Now ask the simple question in plain terms. Why is Simon attacked so aggressively? Why preserve his claims in detail? Why insist so strongly that he is not the true authority? You do not fight that hard against someone irrelevant. You fight that hard when there is confusion on the ground. If two figures are remembered as active in the same region at the same time, connected to the same river initiation stream, using overlapping authority language, and one becomes central while the other becomes a villain, that does not settle the matter. It just raises it. And once you understand, again, that baptism is immersion, and immersion in fire is part of the original promise, then whoever stands in that river claiming fire authority is stepping into John's role and stepping into fulfillment language. So the gospel narrative and the polemics against Simon are not two unrelated stories. They are two accounts preserved from a contested environment. One stream wins and becomes canon. The other stream is labeled heresy. But both streams preserve enough detail to show that the fight was about who carried the real continuation of the river movements. From here, you can push the point gently but firmly. If the institutional church later centralized authority regulating baptisms and defined legitimacy through bishops, then any earlier movement claiming visible fire authentication at immersion would be a threat. That threat would need to be absorbed, it would need to be reframed, and it would definitely be attacked. So now we have to decide what we are looking at. We are looking at a river movement that began with immersion. We are looking at a promise of immersion in fire. We are looking at fire appearing as a sign of spirit. We are looking at a 3rd century writer admitting that some group claimed fire appeared on the water during immersion. We are looking at a rival figure who claimed divine authority, who was tied to baptism, who was attacked heavily by later writers, and whose movement continued after him. This is not random material. Not at all. Either this is coincidence stacked on coincidence, or it is a struggle over who carried the real authority of the river. And once you understand that, the rebaptism controversy makes sense. It was never just about repeating a ritual. It was about control. It was about who decides what counts. It was about whether authority comes from visible spirit presence or from institutional approval. If baptism is immersion, and if immersion in fire was part of the original proclamation, then fire at the water is not decoration. It is legitimacy. And if someone stood in that river claiming that legitimacy, then history did not simply erase him. It argued against him. Thank you for watching. Thank you, and please subscribe, like, and share this video because a lot of people would love to know, would love to understand. Is Simon of Samaria and Jesus the same person? Let's find out on our next video.